There's one word that describes him best and completely, and the word is excellence. He insisted that excellence should be the yardstick by which people should be judged, not color, class, or political affiliation.
Norman Manley is to be hailed for the sincerity, commitment, and integrity that he brought to political life. Norman Manley was never, not once, ever held or accused of doing anything in government that was untoward, that was less than honest and less than sincere. But in everything that he did, Norman Manley was committed to the development of Jamaica, and for that reason, we hail him today, so many years after he has passed on, and generations that come long after ours will have cause to honor the memory of this great national hero.
Norman Manley reflects the best of what I consider to be still the greatest generation of modern Jamaica, in that he has really been the author of our modern democracy in his defense and struggle for the vote, universal adult suffrage, his concern for the internal democracy of the PNP and for the democratic principles to be enshrined in the conduct of the nation.
There can be no doubt that Norman Manley made a huge contribution to Jamaica's development, spanning the period from colonial status to self-government and eventually into independence. We have a constitution that, like any other constitution, is not perfect, but it has guided us through these many years of independence and has underpinned the stability that Jamaica has been able to enjoy. And he was largely responsible for shaping that constitution, not just the 1962 constitution, but the constitutional development from 1944, when we obtained the universal adult suffrage. And many of the safeguards that are in that constitution must be attributed to his own intellect, to his own foresight, to his own understanding of nation building. There are many important advances that he facilitated. I remember he was criticized, for example, when, because of his foresight and his vision, he built a road through what was then the Negril Swamps, and that ushered in the Negril that we know today, which is an international tourist destination. In 1961, I think it was, Ministry Paper number 10, he laid out the plans for the reclamation of lands along the Kingston foreshore, which has now become Newport West. We know, of course, that he was responsible for the building of the National Stadium, the Facilities for Titles Act, which enabled persons who had owned land but had no means of obtaining a title, a registered title, to be able to get one. So that there are a host of initiatives that he undertook, in addition to his overarching guidance in terms of Jamaica's legal and constitutional development, that have earned him the position of a national hero and one of the founding fathers of Jamaica.
Following the tumult and turbulence that occurred not only in Jamaica, but throughout the entire Caribbean at the end of the 1930s, including Frome and the Kingston waterfront, where he was involved as a legal representative for Bustamante and those engaged in the protests and the clamor for better conditions of life. He was approached largely by O.T. Fairclough and eventually converted to the idea he had to take one step further and become the leader of the political process that would drive the national movement, beginning with universal adult suffrage and then self-government, eventually to emerge as an independent nation.
Norman Manley can justifiably take credit for introducing planning in the Jamaican economy. That was what the Plan for Progress was about in 1949, and we all see the results that it gave Jamaica. Here was an economic development plan which carried Jamaica to the top of the developing world. In 1949, the agricultural sector accounted for over a third of the Jamaican economy, and 75% of all economic activities were directly related to agriculture. That year, for the elections, Norman Manley and Noel Levesoul put out the Plan for Progress as the PNP's platform. The PNP lost the elections, but Bustamante bought into the Plan for Progress. And if you look at the House of Representatives and the legislation, both of them are agreed to pass the Pioneer Industries Act. They agree for the Agricultural Development Corporation, the Industrial Corporation. In that 10-year period, Jamaica adds 3 sectors to the economy. From the old traditional agricultural sector, they add mining, bauxite, tourism, and manufacturing. By 1959, Jamaica had 10 years, a decade in which the average GDP growth was over 7%. The Jamaican economy grew faster than any other economy in a developing country in the world. And the whole economic development based on the Plan for Progress extended right up to 1970, when the United Nations survey showed Jamaica in a list of 70 industrial and developing countries. Jamaica ranked 19th with Singapore at 26th. I don't think Jamaica has ever had an economic performance like that. And a fundamental reason is the level of cooperation between Bustamante and Manley over that decade on almost everything to do with the development of the economy.
The most revolutionary act taken by any government since we became a self-governing country was that by Norman Manley, when in 1957 he introduced a system that would award 2,000 free places in our secondary schools to persons irrespective of the families to which they were born. And when I say that, I mean it's not only the initial 2,000 who benefited, but what they were able to achieve professionally and lift members of their community and of their family into a situation where they became professionally qualified to make Jamaica what it is.
because the masses did not have access to education until 1957, when 2,000 children were able to enter high schools through what is called the common entrance. Prior to 1957, only 2 children per parish were allowed to enter high school on scholarships. Our ancestors, after they left school, it was for the women a basket and a machete, and the men hoe and fork. If they were from a higher economic background, the ladies would learn dressmaking. They call it a trade. And the men would perhaps do shoemaking. And when I see today what the educational impact is, I look back and said, do you mean 70, 80 years ago, these would have been the village shoemaker? When I see the lawyers, the doctors, the professionals, I said, wow, but for the grace of God, look what would happen. I see them, and they laugh and they smile and they are professional. But the generation before didn't have that. His approach to government, rational, considerate, and reflected in the huge body of legislation passed during his 7.5 years in office, worked out that on the basis of almost one a week, one piece of legislation a week, and that can be checked. And important pieces of legislation like the facilities for titles law, which allowed ordinary farming folk to be able to access without a title to the land on which they operated, to be able to access loans, the land bonds law, the institutions like the Scientific Research Council celebrating 60 years this year, which he saw as an important part of development. What is now the Planning Institute of Jamaica was called the Central Planning Unit. The bauxite negotiations in 1956-57, the results of which contributed undoubtedly to his government's ability to provide free places to thousands of Jamaicans who would otherwise not have had the opportunity because of the inability to pay for secondary education. And last but not least was his rock-like integrity, which was to many of us a model of how a public servant should behave.
N.W. Manley was no easy taskmaster. He set out very clearly what he wanted done and in what time it should be completed. And of course he didn't have to say it. It had to be quality work, or else he would dismiss it and very often become enraged in doing so.
The man's presence was magnetic. Apart from being a great scholar, a great athlete, a great husband, a great father, great lawyer, he would go through every detail as if he was the murderer or the wrongdoer, to try and see if there was something he was missing. He was absolutely meticulous. Them the kind of man don't make no more. So my grandfather had 2 loves in his life. One was horse racing and the other was Norman Manley. And his excitement over the man named Norman Manley was because my grandpa was a sportsman and he couldn't stop telling people, everybody, he would string the conversation around to the fact that Norman Manley, as a JC boy, ran 100 yards in 10 seconds. And that to my grandfather was the most marvelous feat he had ever heard of. So So it had nothing to do with politics. But politics came in a strange way. I lived at Torrington Road, which joins Torrington Bridge to what is now National Heroes Park. We used to call it Great Schools. And that was 11 Torrington Road. Right in front of us, I think it was number 2 Torrington Road. There was a fabulous old house, one of the Jamaican great houses. What was the name of it again? Hatfield House. Hatfield House. And Hatfield House was beginning to crumble because it wasn't occupied. It was made into a school, and the school was called Normal College. The school eventually locked down, and the place became a printry, and not officially, but it harbored a group of significant politicians. There was Theodore Fairclough, Frank Hill, Ken Hill, H.P. Jacobs. We are talking about 1938. And it is there that sometimes this elegant gentleman, I didn't even know he was Norman Manley, but he would come to meet that group of people because it was they who launched the PNP.
When I came to Kingston, the very house where I stayed in at Torrington Road, I was looking across at a place called City Printry and saw this man in white suit, always white, and that's where he worked. And it is interesting that the person who founded the People's National Party, who went to him to lobby, O.T. Fairclough, his son sings on the choir at a church where I now play the organ.
Skip many years now. And I'm into dancing and all aspects of the arts with the Ivy Baxter group. And through that involvement, I bumped into and got to know at first hand Edna Manley, who was now Manley's wife, and who is known as the mother of the arts in Jamaica. And we became such good friends with Edna and I that she would invite me to produce the Christmas sessions which she had at Drumblair. And I remember one that went very well. I had Reggie Carter reading poetry, and of course the Baxter dancers dancing and so on. And it was here also that I later met Louise Bennett. But now the Prime Minister at the time, our first Prime Minister, who was Bustamante, he was supportive of the arts in that when the Baxter Group needed to tour, he was quite generous in whatever he gave the group. But his presence never really registered. He was never with us in person. Unlike Norman Manley, every time we were going anywhere, the show we were going to present overseas, we had to do it for him. And I remember one of the last was done at what was the Garrison Theatre. It's where the Edna Manley School is now, never lived that long, but it was at the Garrison Theatre we did the performance, and the performance didn't go very well. You know, it was one of those evenings where anything that good spoils got spoiled. But I was a flashy little son of a gun. And when it was over, Norman Manley came to me and he took my hand and he said, "Alma, we are relying on you." That was a charge that I have never forgotten.
It was during the 1959 election campaign. I saw him at Footpath Square. He was doing a sort of whistle stop coming from, I think he was coming from Southern Trelawney. And he stopped at Footpaths. And he was in good spirit. And I saw him do a mentor with a lady from the village, and it was good. It was not just the politician trying to be. It showed you how rooted, despite what people saw as this austere intellectual gentleman, how rooted he was the way he did that. I heard him speak at the old Jamaica School of Agriculture in late 1956, at where the University of Technology is today. And he was speaking about combining an integrated extension service in the agricultural sector. And he was giving some background in regard to his connection to the place. So he said one of the jobs he had after leaving Jamaica College and before he went off to Oxford was to teach English, mathematics, and surveying. He said the first two were fine, quite within his competence. But the third, that is surveying, he knew nothing about, but he managed to keep one lecture ahead of the class, and they always were impressed with the freshness of his knowledge.
I was one of the first winners of a free place to high school. And in my case, the high school had coincidentally been established the same year that the free place was introduced. I never met NW in person, although I attended various functions, political meetings, which he addressed. And at a graduation ceremony at the then Jamaica School of Agriculture, which was then located at Twickenham Park with the police training school in August. He was a guest speaker, and I believe he was also Minister of Agriculture. My brother was a prize graduating student. My parents were very strong supporters of him, so I knew a lot about his history. My father was in the RAF, and he, in a sense, idolized him because of his military background.
I remember we were having a by-election in Manchester, and he was persuaded to come to a meeting in Chudley to address the crowd. We had a candidate running for us. I think his surname was Mullins. So I went with MW to the meeting. And when he went and saw the crowd, better still, the lack of a crowd, he said to me, "Patterson, you have a maximum of 5 minutes to go on the platform and tell them why I will not be speaking here. It's an absolute disgrace and disrespectful that they should have called me when nobody is here." I went on the platform, duly told the crowd that the leader was not speaking, and I think I just caught the back door of the Vanguard motor vehicle that was about to drive out. So his driver was Mr. Graham, and I remember when we reached Old Harbour, he said to Graham, "Graham, if I were going to a funeral, I would have asked for a hearse. Get out of the driver's seat and let me take over." I can simply say I have never prayed as much in my life.
My fondest memory of Norman Washington Manley was as a schoolboy. The bus stop on South Camp Road was right next to the PNP's office, and he would hear us young men discussing public affairs, and he would come out once or twice and engage us about the merits of the Federation and about public service. He stirred in many of us a desire to engage in public life, and that's a very important virtue even to the present.
I knew N.W. Manley as Paddy. He was the first person I saw when I arrived in Jamaica at 2.5. And he became my anchor, the lap that I put my soul to sit upon. And for me, because I don't see him as a national hero in my life. I see he is my hero, my personal hero. And I think if there's any goodness in me, my grandfather taught it to me just by example and the time that we had together. But he was also the most exciting. We would learn things practically from him. You know, I learned that fire was dangerous because he took me into the grass piece and lit it on fire, and it burned the whole damn place down. And that's how I learned that fire was dangerous. You know, he could be quite chaotic. And when I hear people talk about him as in such a serious, almost unimaginative way, as though he's a statue, I think of him sitting on the tree at Namdemy, and he had to limb the tree. And myself and my cousin Norman are sitting there, and Norman says, "I don't think my grandfather is a smart man at all." And I said, "You're crazy. He's the brightest man in all the world. He's a Rhodes Scholar." And as I said this, the limb came tumbling down with my grandfather, who had been sitting on the limb that he was sawing off. So, you know, I see another side of him. And I've always felt that with Jamaica, his great gift was taking from his own head a vision of what nationhood would mean and would be, and putting it into the minds of the Jamaican people. And I say this because I remember during the time of Federation, when they were going up and down the islands, they sent me to boarding school, to keep me safe somewhere. And I remember he would take out the map, the hurricane map, and he would show me the islands, and he'd make me pronounce them. And he made this into the most grand adventure. All these sisters and brothers we were joining with on this journey, and we were all subterraneanly connected to each other. And when I look back at it, I think this was, well, he failed to give that image of federation to the Jamaican people, but I think he did it with the idea of nationhood by making serious things so exciting and symbolic, you know.
My late wife used to visit the courts to listen to his presentations as one of the entertainments of her early life. And as a result of our relationship, we attended the Drumblier dances without question, as they occurred each year at the beginning of the Christmas season. Those were extraordinary experiences, and Norman Manley standing there with his red rosebud in his lapel was something that I can still visualize in my mind. An extraordinarily wonderful experience. And I was also part of, shall we say, the touring of St. Thomas, which once included Norman Manley, going from meeting to meeting, and I had the privilege of trying to follow him in my car when he was driving in the black Jaguar, to try to keep up with him, took all the skills that I had in that day.
Life at Drumblier was, I didn't realize it as a child. I thought everybody's life was like this. But I thought of him as a grand carpenter that was building a nation, because everybody used to tell me, your grandfather is very busy and He's building a nation. And we had these little rituals. He would come in, and my grandmother would be, and it was interesting because they were always in tandem creating. She was creating something culturally for Jamaica in one room. He would be on the back veranda with party executive. I mean, party executive was fun because I used to steal the muffins with N.N. Nethersole. I remember, and this is a favorite memory of mine, in the dining room, we had a huge dining table. So all the federal leaders at the time of Federation would gather around the table for these meetings, you know, Grantley Adams and Byrd and Eric Williams. And Eric and Adams didn't really like each other. Anyway, they were sitting together this day, and I went under the table and I tied the shoelaces together of Mr. Adams and Mr. Williams. And then quietly crept back out. So they couldn't get apart. And my grandfather just loved it. I remember he just put out his hands and he hugged me. Afterwards, he said, "Oh, that was wonderful to see them try and get away from each other." But, and they're not all, some are very poignant memories. I remember Federation meant so much to him. And I remember the night, we had wonderful victories like 1955 election night. But it's funny, everybody looked joyous, but my grandfather always looked thoughtful. He always thought about the implications. He didn't see power as something to celebrate. He realized he had a job to do. But the night of the federal election, I always remember the federal flag was folded on the dining table, and my grandfather always used to sit at the dining table because the rediffusion was in that room, and we used to hear the results on the rediffusion set from RJR. And as it became clear that he had taken a pounding, I came in and I didn't understand the implications, but I remember he came and he said, "Come here, Pi," and he used to call me Pi R squared, which was the sum of his love for me that was everlasting, he said. And he pulled me over to him and he undid the flag, this federal flag, the sun and the waves, this beautiful aqua and orange flag. And he put it around me and he drew me to him. And he just said to me softly, "Never forget this flag." And I never have. I think it's the only thing I believe in Caribbean politics, a real federation. A little while ago, they did a documentary on brothers in the First World War, because my grandfather had been at the Somme with his brother Roy. And the team became so intrigued that this documentary became like half of it was about these two Jamaican brothers. But it was very interesting because I had discovered what I didn't know as a child. He always had a great area of sadness in him, of quietude. And he always wore a black tie, which I knew was in memory of his brother Roy, who was killed after the Somme at Passchendaele. And I would always pick a rose for him that he would put in his little, whatever it was. And we knew that this rose was in memory of his brother, his younger brother who he adored. Anyway, I did not realize, but doing all the research for my third book on my grandmother, I discovered how affected his brother and him had been by the treatment of Jamaicans in the First World War, where, I mean, he had joined in England and his brother joined in England, but the Jamaican volunteers were shockingly treated. They were treated like cannon fodder. And I have always thought since then that this must have been the push that made him go from quite a cocky young Jamaican man whose dad had a plantation. He was a brown man, but, fortunately had a plantation and in Porus. And to go from this to being this ardent nationalist who sometimes almost quite unwillingly took the helm because he wasn't a person crazy about power. And so when I went on this trip, I remember standing where they showed me exactly where his gun had been. They had all the details in the logs, where they had, like for 6 weeks or whatever it was, stood in that mud and shot and shot and shot because they were gunners. And it really affected me. And as I stood there, there was this blue sky that suddenly went dark and the rain came pouring down. Nobody could believe it. And there was a sludge. And the team after that, without telling me, took me to Belgium, which was nearby, to Passchendaele. And they led me to Roy's grave, which none of our family have ever seen. And I just happened to have, for good luck always, in my handbag, a coin with my grandfather's head on it. And I took the coin and I dug a little hole under Roy's grave, and I put the coin down and I united the two brothers. And it was just a wonderful moment. I thought something had come full circle.
The name Washington was deliberately inserted by his parents. Like the famous George Washington, he was a man of courage. And that is a feature of Norman Manley in whatever sphere he operated.
The first 6 years of his life was spent in the relative wealth and comfort of Roxburgh, which his father owned, as a successful exporter of Jamaican fruit. Then, in 1899, when he was 6 years of age, his father died, leaving the family indebted. What caused the indebtedness was the father's habit of taking to court every disagreement he had. He ended up suing his own lawyer. The case went all the way to the Privy Council and he lost. The same year, he lost a shipment of fruit that was uninsured. Then he took down with diabetes. He left the family in poverty. The mother with 3 children decided to take a chance that a lot of Jamaican mothers take, going to the United States to seek employment. She left the 3 children with her sister and found employment in a post office. After a year, it didn't work out. She came back to Jamaica. The widow of a Methodist minister allowed her a part of a house in Raytown. So she chose to take them to Raytown because she could enroll them at Wolmer's, which was a day school. They went to Wolmer's for a year. Money ran out. The family had an old ruined property at Guanabo Vale. She went back there with 3 children, a blind father and an invalid sister, to try to make a living. It was a hard going. Norman said at 12 years old, he was working 12 to 14 hours a day as a bushman. Having spent a year at Wolmer's, he went back to elementary school at Guanabo Vale before getting a half scholarship to Bedford and Smith, which is now St. Jago. Then a scholarship to Jamaica College. At Jamaica College, he runs into problems.
From his days at Jamaica College, he earned the reputation of one who abhorred bullying. And after a few sessions, when the bullies tried to attack him, he prepared himself and put them all to flight.
He still holds a record at Jamaica College. He's the only boy to have been reported by all 7 masters in one day to the headmaster for infringement of the school's rules. What turns him around is the death of his mother, and somehow consciousness of all she had done. He decided to really take a hold of himself. The headmaster was very surprised when Norman Manley announced that he would like to try for the Rhodes Scholarship. The headmaster reminded him that it needed both recommendation as to academic performance as well as character, and on neither count Manley qualified. Fortunately, R.N. Murray was the deputy principal, a friend of the family, who took him under his wing. By that time, his aunts are all off to England, and he's the only member of the family he knows in Jamaica. Holidays, he stays at Jamaica College, he has nowhere to go. But in the last 3 years at Jamaica College, he turns himself around. He captains every team. At Jamaica College, under his leadership, wins the championships, win the Sunlight Cup, win the Manning Cup, win the Oliver Sheep. And then he wins the Rhodes Scholarship.
His achievements on the field of sports at Jamaica College are legendary. He held the 100 yards record for several decades. Many equaled it, his son Douglas included, but the record was not broken until the 1950s. He was also a cricketer, good at both the ball and the bat. And woe betide anybody who would come in contact with his left hook in the boxing ring. Norman Manley earned the coveted Rhodes Scholarship and proceeded to Oxford. He interrupted his studies there to join the military force.
And he and his brother, he was just meeting again after years, go down to get into the army. He thought he would somehow learn to fly a plane, but they told him that colonials, particularly black colonials, that was not an option. He should go and learn to be a gunner.
It's the first time that he came face to face with racism and was a victim of it, and that was something against which he was prepared to fight for the remainder of his life.
I actually grew up in a period of history where there was something called apartheid, and in my lifetime I witnessed blacks and whites not being able to be together in South Africa. Jamaica, under the leadership of Norman Manley, was the first country in the Western Hemisphere to declare, even before we were independent from Britain, that we would not trade with a country that had those kinds of restrictions on black people.
Whose sense of moral purpose was the overarching defining feature. And in a real sense, it is because of this, if one recalls, though he lost the referendum, he tried to make a case of Caribbean independence, not just the independence of individual countries. You had to defeat him by a kind of naked populism without moral regard, and to create stuff that have not been good for the people since then. But that's what strikes me about him, his moral imperative, his moral courage, his sense of moral purpose. And I think that is why he has bequeathed to this generation the idea that we must secure economic independence. But that also is a moral imperative. It's not simply that we have this notion called independence and this notion called out of many one people. We have to find an economic framework in which the people at the base of the population can claim their dignity and their full humanity.
It seemed to me that since his time, there's been a degeneration of the decency, which was a part of his legacy and a part of the functioning at the time. I remember Bustamante himself having a kind of relationship which was admirable. And it translated to the people who we represented and who Bustamante represented. But I regret that now there has been a kind of a deviation from that.
Jamaica has never again achieved the level of collaboration that Manley and Bustamante achieved to put Jamaica forward in the decade 1949 to 1959. And it is most critical because the present challenges that face us, there is no possibility at all of overcoming these challenges unless we can re-establish that level of collaboration at the political level.
We are indebted to Right Excellent Norman Manley for his contribution to nation building, and it behooves us to make sure that that flame we continue.
And therefore, even 50 years after his passing, we still have to commit and recommit ourselves to the completion of the vision of this giant of Jamaica's nationhood, who, as I put it, is the best of the best generation that we have had in modern Jamaica.
I never knew the extent of the economic hardship that Norman Manley experienced in his last years. And I know it would surprise many Jamaicans who are of the view that politicians are people who are always on the take, and they end their careers in politics much richer than they went in. Not so with Norman Manley. Drumblere, the property that Norman Manley acquired when his law practice was at its height in 1933, and the home which for 28 years served Jamaica as an intellectual center, as the center of the national movement, at the home that created such institutions as the Jamaica Amateur Athletic Association, the Jamaica Boxing Board, the place where the editorial board of public opinion met, where the directors of Jamaica Welfare met. Norman Manley had been selling pieces of drumblere regularly to finance the PNP and specifically to finance election campaigns. The last campaign was a referendum in 1961, which he lost in September, and in October of that year, drumblere was sold at a public auction for £30,000. They got the Manley family, through Edna's instrumentality, got one of the lots in which they put up a small 2-bedroom flat, which Edna called Regardless. As his granddaughter Rachel informs, it was a very uncomfortable existence for Norman, accustomed to his wooden floor at Drumblere and walking up and down to his library to read. On the cold concrete floor, he simply sat in a chair for most of the time. His last words were, "This place is too expensive." Then which was his last word. Now, for my generation, I don't know that we have done enough to make Norman Manley a part of the consciousness of the generations coming after. And I don't know that Jamaica will move forward if it remains in ignorance of those who have laid the foundations on which progress has been made, or seizes the opportunity to assess that progress and to see where we can move on from where we are.
His son Michael, 30 years ago, asked me to take over the chairmanship of the Norman Washington Manley Foundation, and it has been a privilege for these many years to have been able to play my role with the family and with the remembrance and recording of the contribution of this man to this nation of ours. As a son of Jamaica and father of the nation. What was the Norman Manley Foundation about? Was to be able to acknowledge and reward people who had made an indelible contribution to life in Jamaica in a various number of categories and were given what was known and still is known as the Norman Washington Manley Award of Excellence. This is an award which could be arguably the most significant and important award given to a Jamaican. It's an extraordinarily valuable award, not in terms of the cash, but in terms of the recognition of the service of a person to the people of Jamaica. And that tells a story, in my view, of what Norman Manley stood for, the people of Jamaica. I'll never forget one of the awardees of the Norman Washington Manley Award, when he got up, was almost speechless. All he could do was repeat, "My hero, my hero." I could say similarly that is the impression I've had of Norman Manley. His work in terms of many aspects of Jamaican life, the development of education, his role in Jamaica welfare, bringing our peasant folk out of the post-enslavement societies into a modern life, his work in terms of the legislation that he created for a number of different areas, and more interestingly, and more particularly, institutions that he created during his role as chief minister, which prepared us for independence. And these are still there with us, keeping us, guiding us, and helping us to become the people who have been able to, in fact, successfully, I think, today, overcome the coronavirus with the disciplines that we understand are necessary to run a country. So I'm very proud to say that I'm still the chairman of the Norman Manley Foundation, and hopefully when we've completed the Manley Center in the last home where he lived, regardless, we will have left a legacy for the rest of the country and for future generations.